there were many Americans who did not have the jobs that would offer them health insurance. And just as importantly, there were members of the country's still celebrated greatest generation, those who had answered the call to fight overseas, answered the call to build an arsenal of democracy at home to defeat the Axis powers. Y'all, they were nearing retirement. They were nearing retirement with no guarantee that they could stay on their employer's health insurance. So this is why there's a need to amend the Social Security Act, which had always been hoped to have health insurance to include Medicare and Medicaid.
Hi, everyone. My name is Steve Guerrero. I'm the Director of Education here at the Charles River Museum of Industry and Innovation in Waltham. You are sitting in what was once the power plant of the Boston Manufacturing Company, started by Francis Cabot Lowell in 1813, who built the world's first modern factory on our National Historic Site here in Waltham. It's also a really important place for tonight's topic. This is the first place of corporate-sponsored housing, for example. The first coordinated force of mill girls was here working for the textile mill. And the mill girls were paid in cash, which is a big deal because we have all the ledger books at the Baker Library at Harvard Business School that tracks the mill girls and their kind of avenues for advancement, increases in pay, average pay, and it tells us a lot about these mill girls whose writings we don't have. We don't have first-person accounts of any of the mill girls of Waltham, but we do have their pay on a weekly basis from 1814 when this place first got started all the way through 1929 when it liquidated. Tonight, we're going to be talking about paychecks and democracy, small d democracy, and I'm so glad you're here to join us. Our museum was founded by Michael Brewster Folsom, an MIT teacher of industrial history. It was really important to him for us to preserve the industrial history of America, for us to understand how our modern society was built on the Industrial Revolution and that the legacy of that industrialization is still with us now. Tonight's speaker is University of Georgia history professor Elizabeth Tandy Shermer, whose new volume is out, Work, Capitalism, and Democracy. It's a great read. I highly recommend. In fact, it was so good, I had to have Professor Shermer come here and talk to us directly. Professor Shermer.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Steve. I was so thrilled to be asked to talk here tonight. I am a labor historian by training, which also means you have to talk about capitalism, you have to talk about business, and there's no better place to talk about that than here, than this site. And so I always begin talking about this project, and this project, actually that volume, is a way of moving into this project on paystub politics. And so the question I always ask people is, when is the last time that you checked your pay stub? And it's a difficult question because most Americans don't anymore. According to a recent survey, 92% of respondents get their wages through direct deposit. Less than 4% receive a paper check. Other times we're talking about maybe a Venmo or some of the electronic payment methods like that. And I will tell you right now, in a moment of honesty, the last time I received a paper check was in the summer of 2003, almost 25 years ago. My employer would put a check in my mailbox every 2 weeks. Attached was a pay stub, which I promptly recycled. I didn't even look at it. And the thing is, why would I? I had just graduated from college, and I needed to get that check deposited. I need to tear it off. I need to get it in there. It was before you could deposit a check with your phone, like I do now. And I needed that money. I had to pay rent pay, and I paid it with a check. I had groceries to buy, and I was also saving for my move out to California to start graduate school, a PhD program in history. And the other thing I need to admit is that 21-year-old me did not know anything about the acronyms and abbreviations for all the money taken out of my pay every 2 weeks. I hadn't really seen them before. I actually had got my first job in high school. I was 15 years old, but my earnings then had been directly deposited into my bank account, and I never received a paper pay stub, at least that I remember. And I probably could have somewhere logged in to some HR website to check what had been taken out, but I sure as heck did not know what acronyms like FICA stood for.
but now I do. And more importantly, I make sure that my students know that the Federal Income Contributions Act, FICA, FICA, I want them to know what that is. That is the tax employees and employers use to pay for Social Security and Medicare. It's often on two separate lines and sometimes abbreviated as something else. And I want my students to be able to read their pay stubs for two big reasons. The first is we have a problem with wage theft in the United States. We really do. The National Institute for Workers' Rights estimates that US employers annually steal, that is the verb that they used, $15 billion from workers, less than 3% of which is recovered annually. But it is a lot harder for employers to shortchange hardworking Americans if those Americans know how to read their pay stubs, if they actually know how to read their pay stubs. But here's the other reason I want to get my students to check their pay stubs. I think of all of those deductions as memorials, ways to honor 20th century struggles over just what kind of economy, what kind of society, what kind of democracy this country is going to have. And so that's why I was so honored and thrilled when Steve asked me to speak here at the Charles River Museum of Industry and Innovation this summer. And of course, it is the site of the first recorded strike that we have, 1821. For those of you who are not with us tonight, there's a wonderful exhibit that I encourage you to come and check it out. But it seems a really important moment to be talking about these 20th century struggles because the greater Boston area, just like the whole rest of the country, is focused on the democratic revolution that started 250 years ago. But I'm here to tell you that those pay stubs are also monuments to small d democratic revolutions. And why is that? The 1783 Treaty of Paris, the later ratification of the US Constitution, was just the start of this ongoing American democratic experiment. And that's because Americans have and they continue to debate and fight and experiment with small d democracy, not just in the public square and civil society, but y'all on the job, actually on the job, whether that job is in a factory, whether it's in a schoolhouse, or on the buses and trains that keep Bostonians moving that I've been using to get around here since I arrived a few days ago. But tonight, I only want to look at three deductions, and they're highlighted here. Union dues, FICA for Social Security, and on this template of a pay stub, it's actually done the SS tax, not necessarily seen that way, and health insurance. In this case, this one is calling it medical insurance. Now, two of those, union dues and FICA or Social Security, they have their origins in the 1930s. Which I think we should think of as another revolutionary moment for Americans that I hope will get a lot of attention when we reach the 100th anniversary of those democratic experiments to bring democracy into the workplace. And we're just a few years away from them. But why focus tonight on just those three deductions? And I think it is because individually and together, these deductions memorialize past struggles to create a more perfect, a more small d democratic union. So I want to start tonight with union dues. That might seem odd to some of you in the audience today, although I see some of you wearing your union swag, which I always like to see, because according to the US Bureau of Labor Statistics for 2025, only 14.7 million workers were union members in this country in 2025. That is just 10% of all wage and salary workers. And that number accounts for just 5.9% of private sector workers, but almost 33% of public sector workers, meaning those of us who work for local, state, and federal governments. And I do need to add here is that at the height of the American labor movement, that is in the mid-1950s, only about a third of non-farm workers belong to a recognized union. And when we talk about this, as I go into it, I want to think about non-farm workers that focus on that, but also a recognized union. Because Americans have come together to protest unfair working conditions since the beginning of this country. And indeed, of course, we're in one of the great places to talk about this because some of the most famous were from Massachusetts. And so here we have this wonderful sort of newspaper depiction of the Lowell Mill Girls who come together in their Factory Girls Association in the early 19th century. And this actually is from this advertisement got cut off It's 75 young women from age 15 to 35 looking for jobs in these cotton mills near us today. And I think that it's really important to draw attention to these women, also the first to go on a recorded strike that we have, because the image that most Americans have of industrialization, of unions, is those steel workers, is those auto workers. But actually, we have always had a much more varied labor movement, a much more activist sort of labor movement than that. And so these little girls, these mill girls, organized in the early 19th century. They famously strike in 1834. That is the one that you'll find in your textbooks, maybe not the 1821 here that I mentioned before. And those women were defeated in 1834, and then again when they struck in 1836. But I think what's important about them, they did not give up. They moved into politics. And they moved into politics decades before the more famous Midwestern Railroad and steel strikes of the late 19th century, the ones that my students, when I used to work in Chicago, knew all about. And they also got into politics. Those young women got into politics decades before the passage of the 19th Amendment in 1920. That they're still, and they may not be able to vote, but they're going to be engaged in politics. They're going to be pushing for that then seen as progressive 10-hour day, long before we get to the idea for the 8-hour day. But the thing is, employers would not be compelled to deduct union dues from your paycheck until after the passage of the 1935 National Labor Relations Act, probably better known as the Wagner Act. And we call it the Wagner Act to name its famous champion, New York Democratic Senator Robert Wagner. And I always love this picture of him. This is a 1934 cover of Time magazine. And you see Robert Wagner there at the podium. And I love this, that he is making the cover of Time magazine in 1934, because it becomes this idea that in the heart of the Great Depression, in the heart of the New Deal, central to this were actually labor struggles to bring democracy to the shop floor. Now, the Wagner Act's preamble, in it, lawmakers stress the need to, quote, ensure the free flow of commerce. And what they're alluding to then is that there's a tremendous amount of strike activity in the 1930s. And what they're trying to talk about is we have to find a way to end all these strikes. But what's really interesting about the start of the Wagner Act, lawmakers did not blame workers, as they had so long before. They blamed employers. The blame is to be found with employers. And lawmakers are arguing in 1935 that the federal government had to protect, quote, the exercise by workers of full freedom of association, self-organization, and the designation of representatives of their own choosing, for the purpose of negotiating the terms and conditions of their employment or other mutual aid or protection. Now, I happen to love this poster from the UAW, and there we see the famous way of describing the Wagner Act as labor's Magna Carta. And so what the UAW is showing here is FDR, President FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, signing the Wagner Act. Behind him is standing Robert Wagner, and I'll talk about the woman behind him as Frances Perkins in a little bit. But I think when you think about what we're talking about, the exercise of full freedom of association, self-organization, designation of representatives of their own choosing, y'all, that sounds a lot like the Bill of Rights. It sounds a lot like the Constitution. And I think we need to imagine the Wagner Act as a way of bringing democracy on the job, bringing it right into the factory floors. But Robert Wagner does not deserve the credit for this law bringing democracy on the shop floor, and neither does FDR. And I say that even though here's another favorite poster of mine. This is from the Congress of Industrial Organizations, Portland Labor Union, labor organization in the 1930s. And they're quoting here on this poster, FDR saying when he signed this law, if I went to work in a factory, the first thing I would do is to join a union. But you know what? That payroll deduction that we see for union dues on paychecks, even today, is really a memorial to the ordinary people, the ordinary workers who use this law to elect unions of their choosing. Because it's not enough to actually get a law passed. We actually have to enforce. We have to enforce the law. And that is where ordinary people came in, because this federal law yes, on paper, forced employers to recognize those unions, but people have to organize the unions, right? And then it empowered federal officials to ensure employers bargained in good faith with elected union representatives. So you have to have the union elections to get those folks elected. And you're going to reach agreements, we call them employment contracts, union contracts, and those contracts tended to improve wages and hours and working conditions, but they only go into effect after union members voted to accept the terms of those contracts. Y'all, that is democracy on the job. That's what that is there. And one of the things that unions could, and they would bargain for, is union security. It's a very fancy phrase for membership because there is strength in numbers. First and foremost, to get your union recognized, you have to have 50% of the membership to vote for the union. But you want more than 50%. You want hopefully 100%. Hopefully 100%, because there are strength in numbers to get a better contract, right? To get a better contract. Now, there were and still are different ways that contracts can provide for unions security. Like, for example, the one I'm going to talk about today, which is that automatic payroll deduction for union dues. This is not mandated in the Wagner Act. It is something a union can bargain for in a contract. And those deductions, they might seem trivial, but you know what? Membership dues matter a lot. They matter a lot now, and they mattered a lot in the past. Y'all, it takes money to make sure a contract is being enforced, especially if you have to go into arbitration. It costs money. It costs money to bargain that next contract. And it costs money to build a strike fund so that if you have to go on strike, members can be sustained during a strike when they are not getting a paycheck. These union dues matter. And here again, I will admit, when I was a graduate student in California, I still did not check my pay stub. I did not check my pay stub. And I will admit, never got a paper check with one attached. But my union, UAW, so United Auto Workers, Local 2865, representing the University of California teaching assistants, TAs, and graders, they never had to nag me to pay my dues, because our contract had them automatically deducted from our paychecks. They just went right there. But the thing is, the Wagner Act did not guarantee me or other academic employees the right to form a union of our choosing or to have our employer recognize it. Why was that? We worked for the University of California. Y'all, that is a public employer. It's a public employer. And the Wagner Act in 1935 excluded Americans working in agriculture, domestic, or public employment, meaning no farm workers, no maids, no cooks, no public school teachers, or city bus drivers. The Wagner Act also excluded independent contractors. In the past, what that would mean is a door-to-door salesman. Think of Willy Loman. Now, of course, it means our Uber and Lyft drivers, because the whole gig economy is built on independent contractors. Why exclude all those hardworking people, particularly in the 30s and in the depths of the Depression? Y'all, just like today, it comes down to politics. It is true, liberal Democrats and Republicans were desperate to offer Americans a New Deal in the mid-1930s, but they needed the votes of those conservatives in Congress, many of them Democrats from the West and South, the more agricultural regions of the country. And those Democrats from the West and South, they loved the New Deal's big infrastructure projects, like the Tennessee Valley Authority, better known as the TVA, that brings water and electricity across the South. Western Democrats also loved the major highway improvements in California, like the 101 that I drove up and down when I was living out there going to grad school. But those representatives had no interest in bringing in democracy into farm fields, into wealthy households, or government services that relied on a veritable army of poorly paid workers, many of them women, a lot of them Black, Latino, Jewish, and Catholic, and Asian. Guaranteeing those Americans, those immigrants, democracy on the job was sure to upend the American South and West racial order that kept elite white men at the top. But you know what? Farm workers, domestic service, city bus drivers, public employees, they could and they did still form unions, and some employers even recognized them and hammered out union contracts. Example for tonight, Boston's Carmen's Union had been bargaining with the city years before and after the Wagner Act's passage. But I think what's really important to think about here in this moment is that it would not be until the 1960s that some states, mostly in the Northeast, the Midwest, and Pacific Coast, the states, not the federal government, started passing laws protecting public employees' right to organize a union of their contract to bring democracy to their workplaces. In the case of Massachusetts, since this is where I'm here tonight, it's in 1965 that municipal workers have the right to collectively bargain. It is 8 years later, in 1973, that stake workers are given those same rights. But the thing is, reporters and politicians pay less attention to the small d democratic spirit interwoven into the labor movement. They're usually, if they cover union contracts or strikes at all, they're talking about wages, they're talking about hours, they're talking about benefits, especially retirement and healthcare, both of which appear as payroll deductions. And so let's talk about retirement first. So it's right there. This one, in this case, it's not showing up as, for this pay stub template, it's showing up as the SS tax, Social Security tax, as opposed to FICA, which is what it shows up on mine right now. When the phrase Social Security appears in the news today, usually with two capital S's, Social Security, it generally stands for what was called at the time old age insurance or a pension. Terminology that has fallen out of fashion. If you say old age insurance to people today, they are not going to know what you're going to talk about, and they often don't know what a pension is either. They're much more familiar with something else that will show up on a pay stub, like a 401k. We do see that one here. 403bs for those of us who work in the public sector, sometimes the IRAs. And indeed, in the case of my students, who are wonderful, they do happen to have heard about 401ks, something like that. But I think what's even more confusing about Social Security is they often appear as FICA, F-I-C-A, the acronym for the Federal Income Contributions Act that compelled employees and employers to pay for the much more well-known 1935 Social Security Act. They're passed about a couple months beforehand. And here I want to take a moment and talk about our self-employed, our independent contractors, because they have to play both. They have to play not just what an employee would be contributing to FICA, but also employers. And we need to think about that today. So this landmark legislation, this 1935 Social Security Act, it included so much more than federal pensions or old age insurance, which is all that Social Security, at least when the public talks about it, thinks about. And here we have Labor Secretary Frances Perkins. She was in the background of that UAW poster about the Magna Carta for Labor that was Wagner Act. And she actually addressed Americans over the radio in 1935 to explain the important parts of the bill that Congress was then fighting over. And it's really interesting because for her, what she said the most important part of the bill was in 35 was unemployment insurance, which she called the greatest of all hazards. And I think that's important to think about too, because so much of the New Deal in terms of your guarantees to it is about being employed. And that's why that unemployment insurance, that cushion to get you to the next job, was so important. But that law, that 35 law, also included money for the old age security as a part of a broad plan for economic, social, societal security, which extended to, in this act, some support for the blind, child welfare, and public health. But before any American could receive their benefits, Americans had to register for those Social Security cards. Now, when I ask my students about their Social Security cards, I ask them if how many of them remember signing it. I'll be honest, I don't remember signing my little blue card, although I know that I did because I know where it is. It's been a while since I looked at it. But I like talking to them about it, I said, when did you get your Social Security card? And they got it when they were born. But let's take a look. And this is a specimen. This is actually you can actually find early Social Security cards on eBay if you really want one. But the early specimen that they have online as an example from the Social Security Administration's own history, note that it says employee's signature, because this is something that was tied to your employment. That it's not, and there's another copy that I actually have an early one that says not for identification purposes. Because that, of course, is the first thing that Americans give to identify themselves is their 9-digit Social Security card. And my students are always mortified because I tell them that my very first driver's license from the state of Virginia had my 9-digit social security number on it. And my very first undergraduate student ID from the University of Virginia had my 9-digit social security card, which no one would ever think about today. And the reason I bring that up is because historian Sarah Igo has done incredible work to show that Americans in 1935 were also concerned about all the data that they had to share, not just with the government, but also their employer, in order to get this 9-digit social security card on a very flimsy card. But you know what? 25 million Americans had still registered for these cards within 4 months of registration. That's an incredibly fast turnaround. And you can see we have actually examples of posters and flyers that the federal government created, join the march to old age security. So even in 35, they're focusing actually on that old age insurance, that pension plan, and it's something that you're going to do. And why would 25 million people in just 4 months sign up for this? Because those 9 digits promised not just economic security, but rights on the job that could lead to a better life at home, a more comfortable life at home. And what these little cards are doing is expanding what it means to be a full citizen of the country. You don't have to worry about having to work until your older years. You don't have to worry about if you lose your job, you're going to have that unemployment insurance. And I think it's really sort of extending this idea that full citizenship of this country means that you will have access to that life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness that was put into the Declaration of Independence 250 years ago. Now, for Americans, we have evidence of this, that when they got their cards, there was a real sense of pride and belonging and security in having one of these little cards, so much so that it even seeped into popular culture. One of my favorite examples, Nancy Drew, girl detective, 1937 mystery. She has got to go undercover in a job. She's worried that she's not going to be able to get it. But luckily, she whips out her social security card and she can get employed and she can solve that mystery, because of course she does. Another favorite of mine, starlet Betty Davis, she had her 9-digit social security card engraved on a gold bracelet. Other Americans would put them on rings. And some Americans actually bought something far sturdier than those flimsy government-issued cards. They would actually buy from, admittedly, businesses who were marketing to them, that you could have a solid metal plate to actually have your social security card. So you don't have to worry about ripping it or losing it or tearing it or anything like that. We do have evidence, too, of Americans putting them on rings, having their social security cards on rings. Other Americans, I kid you not, Sarah Igo found this in her book, they had their numbers engraved on their dentures. So you need to show it, you just pull it out and you can show it right there. And some Americans would actually get a tattoo. They'd actually get a tattoo. So as popular as those cards, those numbers, those payroll deductions were, the president, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, FDR, did not take credit for the Social Security Act or the less well-known FICA. 3 years after passage of those two laws, when the law had already helped millions, he celebrated the American labor movement that had already helped democratize shop floors because of the Wagner Act. What the president said in 1938 is the underlying desire for personal and family security was nothing new. Americans have been turning to friends and neighbors and family members as a source of security. It was an American tradition, not just our individualism or self-help, but actually to look to our communities for that. But he argued ordinary men and women needed more help as the country industrialized, as we went from cotton mills to steel factories. The first to turn to the federal government for help during the country's tumultuous industrialization, the president argued, had not been the poor and the lowly, but the rich and the strong. The wealthy profited, the president argued, from, quote, protective laws designed in the main to give security to property owners, to industrialists, to merchants and bankers, not the social security that he was promoting. That same elite also fought workers organizing unions and demanding labor legislation, protective labor legislation. And FDR was proud in 38 that there were laws now on the books that raised the standard of life. But the president still argued Americans still gave those laws, those New Deal laws, even in 38, still gave no assurance to economic security. The federal government had to do more to help individuals lay the foundation stones their better lives on and off the job. And so what he was saying in 38, quote, "It is not good enough. Citizens deserved," he's saying this in 1938, "adequate health and medical service, as well as, quote, some protection against the economic losses arising out of ill health." He also had to admit many Americans did not qualify for Social Security benefits. Quote, "Because of the nature of their employment, this must be set right, and it will be." Now, what he's referring to there is the same workers excluded from the Wagner Act were also excluded from the Social Security Act. And in fact, you can see it on that poster there, that you can see who is eligible, and it says there right clearly, agriculture, domestic service, and government workers are actually excluded. So it admits it there. And that reflects those same representatives in Congress that insisted that those same working people be excluded from the Wagner Act, as well as potent opposition from leading businessmen like Kodak executive Marion Folsom. He and other conservative Republicans insisted that the old age benefits, they should not be enough to fully retire on. Instead, they were willing to say these Social Security benefits, this old age insurance, would be a supplement to the retirement offerings from businesses that also offered the health insurance companies had begun to offer before the Great Depression, had upended the economy and ushered in a period of hard-fought, bitterly contested, small d democratic reform that really shaped the entire 1930s. And that brings us to our final deduction for tonight, health insurance. Now, the thing is, health insurance was not new at all in the 1930s. Insurance companies, and actually you see some great hints of this in the exhibits here in the museum, insurance companies had been offering insurance to businesses. And insurance companies by the late 19th century are offering individual policies to Americans wealthy enough to take them out. But insurance companies started offering large companies, usually manufacturers, group policies that would cover all employees, and they're offering old age, life, and health insurance by the early 20th century. But I think an interesting question to ask is, why would an employer buy those health insurance policies for their workforces? And indeed, I think one of the exhibits here tonight does a really great job about it, is sort of pointing out that the Boston Manufacturing Company is lauded for some of its really interesting and innovative experiments in making this a good place to work. It was also the place of the first strikes. So why would employers offer these insurance policies? One is stability. Coming to the idea in the early 20th century, it's better if we have the same workers showing up. They have the skills, they have the knowledge, we want a more stable workforce. The other is also power. Because if your employees are depending on you for your old age insurance, your health insurance, you're more likely to keep them. And the other is actually these employers, these business owners had this idea that they were the ones who should be offering these benefits to their employers, not the government. And indeed, that brings us to the last way that why you might want to offer this is to stop efforts to have at the local and the federal level workmen's compensation laws, all these other things. We're already doing it. There's no reason to do this at all. But employee health insurance plans became much more common during World War II, which many historians, myself included, think of a period when the New Deal was actually expanded. Now, this can come to a shock to many people because I'm betting a lot of you have heard this idea that the New Deal failed to end the Great Depression. The Great Depression was ended during World War II. And that's an interesting idea, and it comes actually from a very concerted business-led campaign, particularly from the National Association of Manufacturers during World War II, to saying that what was happening during World War II had nothing at all to do with the New Deal. But let's think critically about that. Because as a friend of mine, a wonderful historian out at the University of California would say, you're right. The Japanese have just bombed Pearl Harbor. We're going to get rid of everyone in charge of running the country and replace them with new people who somehow look exactly like them and have the same name. It's the same people that continue. FDR was the only president elected for 4 terms, And so we really do think about the World War II as offering this moment to expand the New Deal nationwide to those who had not had access to it. And there's some pivotal decisions that really make that possible. The first one that I think is important is Roosevelt's executive order that war production would have to take place in the interior of the country. So instead of in World War I, when you have the steel belt, right, the steel belt that runs from New England all the way into the Midwest, that is the site of a lot of the production for World War I. Instead, in the name of national defense, we should have war production taking place all across the country to spread it out. And it is absolutely true that this is a better mechanism to make sure that no part of the arsenal democracy, as FDR was calling it, is actually going to be under threat. It's all spread out. But the other is, this is a concerted effort to get those good manufacturing jobs, building guns, making ammunition out across the country. The second pivotal decision is an executive order creating the Fair Employment Practice Commission, better known as the FEPC. And this is one of my favorite stories to talk about because it's early 1940s. FDR has promised that there's going to be an arsenal of democracy, that all Americans need to do their part. And the leader of the Brotherhood of the Sleeping Car Porters, A. Philip Randolph, says there needs to be equal opportunities for those jobs, equal opportunities. And he says what we need is a march on Washington for jobs and justice. That is what he calls it. And the last thing that you want, if you are the president, is a march on Washington, bringing attention to all this injustice. And so that march on Washington does not happen, but A. Philip Randolph is there for the one in 1963 that happens 20 years later, because Roosevelt had says, I will issue an executive order. And that executive order admits that there is discrimination in hiring practices, and they focus on race, they focus on country of origin, and they focus on religion. No mention of sex, but that executive order still creates the Fair Employment Practice Commission. And why that is important is it gives ordinary Americans to file complaints about discrimination, not just from their employers, but also their unions, to say we are not being treated well, and a mechanism to actually have those injustices solved. It is absolutely true that the FEPC is the most effective in New England and the Midwest, but it still doesn't change the fact that you have people all over the country looking to the FEPC that they will not be discriminated, they will have a fair shot at those really good jobs. Another important decision made at the federal level, price controls. We're at a moment of shortages, we want to keep the prices down, but price controls also extends to the salaries that you can pay for people in terms of keeping the wages that they don't get too inflationary. But there also is an effort to hammer out agreements between union leaders, businesses that are acting as government contractors, to build this arsenal of democracy, and the federal officials. And if a union agrees not to strike, not to stop production, then they are going to have the opportunity to get the maintenance of membership clause, that if they have 50%, they're going to get recognized and they're going to have 100% of the membership. That is a tremendous amount of power. And with that kind of power, you may not be able to bargain for a raise because of price controls, but you know what you can bargain for? Employee benefits, like health insurance. And this is when we start to see health insurance really show up on pay stubs. And it's exactly as we see often today, where an employer and employee are splitting the cost of the health insurance. My favorite example about what a pivotal moment is for World War II to normalize this practice is Henry Kaiser gave us his name to his Kaiser Industries, known for steel. In fact, really important in building the Oakland shipyards, which were so pivotal to the armament on the West Coast. But he also starts, for his employees, something called Kaiser Permanente, which y'all might have heard of. And I would argue today that most Americans now know more about Kaiser Permanente, the health insurer, than they do anything about Kaiser Steel. And in fact, if you go to Kaiser Permanente's website, they'll actually talk about this pivotal moment with World War II. And I think in terms of thinking about just how far spread this is thinking about how these pivotal decisions work out together. So this is a map that I love to show. This is just this is money for civilian pilot training programs. And what's important about it is that we can see it's all across the country. It is true that there's a concentration in the Northeast and Midwest. We can also see it on the West Coast. But the most important thing to think about this is that anytime you have this kind of investment, you're usually talking about other war production factories as well. These kinds of things sort of crop up together. And in terms of thinking about the meaning that this has, this is an image from Air Force Plant number 6 in Marietta, Georgia. Now seen as part of the Atlanta area, but it was actually a more agricultural era. It was known for cotton in the early 1940s. And within a year of Marietta getting the contract to build Air Force Plant number 6, better known as the Bell Bomber Plant, they have a full plant online that at peak employment has 28,000 Americans working in it. So 28,000 people who have an opportunity not to pick cotton, but to actually work in the kind of manufacturing job that will give you access to those pay stub deductions. And that's what they're doing here, and sort of celebration. So this is the plant. It's the largest aircraft manufacturing assembly facility in the world in the 1940s. This is where they're putting together B-29s, and including the B-29s that will drop the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But then all the way on the other side of the country, we have Phoenix, Arizona. This is just the Goodyear plant. But in the case of Phoenix, Arizona, which when a banker showed up there in 1935, he took a look around and he said, they have some paved streets, a couple of tall buildings, but it looks pretty much as close to hell on earth as you can get. And it is hot in Phoenix in the summer. But they attract 3 big wartime contractors. Goodyear, this is the picture of the Goodyear plant there. Goodyear, Alcoa, and AI Research. Thousands more in Phoenix, which is also a site for one of the most important pilot training programs for the Allied powers. And the reason I put Phoenix and Atlanta, and Marietta together, these are both places that were dependent on agriculture, particularly cotton, although in Phoenix you do actually have a lot of citrus. And so all of a sudden you're bringing in jobs and opportunities that have nothing to do with agriculture that would have been excluded from the New Deal, and bringing in thousands of jobs that actually make it possible for you to have those union dues, to make it possible for you to have that Social Security, and also they do have unions in both places. You can bargain for some health insurance, and that's where it happens. Now, I think one of the great tragedies, though, that we never talk about is usually the image that y'all have about, or Americans have, of the shift from the wartime to the peacetime economy is Detroit factories that go seamlessly from making tanks to going back to making cars again. That's not the case in war production factories that are out in the interior, because those were hastily built to do just that site. And so a lot of them are starting to close. In the case of Marietta, within about a year of the end of the war, the Marietta site is empty. And that's 28,000 jobs that are gone. 28,000 jobs that are gone. It's just as bad as in Phoenix, Arizona as well. So you have thousands of Americans finding themselves out of work, even though they were doing the work of building that arsenal of democracy, with almost 12 million veterans coming back from overseas. So you have this moment where it could be a true economic crisis. But the thing is, what had happened is the New Deal had done so much to raise expectations for jobs, even if its protections did not touch all job sectors. One of the things that helps, 1930s, we have also a minimum wage, maximum hours. That's 1938 Fair Labor Standards Act. And a lot of workers remain excluded. But in order to attract workers, you're going to have to offer that 8-hour day. In order to retrain workers, you're going to have to offer that health insurance. You're going to have to do that. And I will say, in the case of the unionized firms, it's important to have the unions there that are actually bargaining for those kind of contracts. For non-unionized firms, like Marion Folsom's Kodak, well, you just want to stop the organizing. There's no reason to organize here. We already have those health insurance benefits, things like that. And this is the moment. It is during World War II, but certainly after, where that health insurance becomes more common. But here's a question. How did we end up with pay stubs with 2 FICA deductions, one for Social Security and one for Medicare? And we can see them right here. I have them highlighted in this case. The second FICA deduction appeared after Congress amended the 1935 Social Security Act 30 years later in 1965. And I like to think about this as a part of an effort in the 1960s to complete the New Deal in the name of building a great society, championed by the last New Dealer in the White House, Lyndon Baines Johnson. And this is my favorite picture to show of a young Lyndon Baines Johnson. He's there in the middle and he's beaming. And it has been told that this is the moment when he met FDR, and FDR famously said that this bright young Texan, he might be the first Southern president in a generation. And in terms of thinking about this, to bring us back to it, in 1938, so around the time that this picture was taken, FDR had publicly admitted on the radio that more was needed to guard the individual's health, which he recognized as good for the country's economic health and the greater society. It was for social security, societal security. And decades later, in the 60s, there was real awareness that poverty had persisted despite the more familiar images of post-war prosperity. Y'all have seen them, the single-family homes, the car in the garage, the children on the bicycles. But there were many Americans who did not have the jobs that would offer them health insurance. And just as importantly, there were members of the country's still celebrated greatest generation, those who had answered the call to fight overseas, answered the call to build an arsenal of democracy at home to defeat the Axis powers. Y'all, they were nearing retirement. They were nearing retirement with no guarantee that they could stay on their employer's health insurance. So this is why there's a need to amend the Social Security Act, which had always been hoped to have health insurance to include Medicare and Medicaid. And it's signed into law. That is signed into law by LBJ, so you can see him signing here. And who's actually sitting next to him is Harry Truman, because Harry Truman had tried to extend health insurance to all Americans when he was president. But I want to emphasize here that, yet again, Johnson is passing a law. Johnson is signing a law that was passed by Congress. And why did senators and representatives do this? They were responding to voters demanding they do something about civil rights, about voting rights, immigration, housing and education, and many other issues that Americans still want Congress to do something about today. And I think the way that I like to think about the 1960s is this idea of this attempt to complete the New Deal, is you had this opportunity for more Americans to be civically engaged, because in the 1930s, there had been laws that had been passed to create Social Security. There had been laws to pass union recognition, so you could have contracts that gave you that 8 hours for what you will, and also the Fair Labor Standards Act that says you're going to have just 8 hours for work, you're going to be paid overtime if you do it. It gives people the time. It gives people the time to actually be civically engaged. And my great example of that, just to bring us back, is I always ask people, do you know what day of the week the March on Washington was? The one that we actually have in the 60s? And they always guess these days a Saturday or Sunday, because we have our protests on weekends. Y'all, it was a Wednesday. It was a Wednesday because Americans had enough security of their employment that they could go into Washington. So it's a double protest. I'm not on the job, but I'm also here in Washington. And in this particular case, it's the Wednesday before Labor Day. So Wednesday before Labor Day. And the reason that this matters is when I worked in Chicago, I'd have my students listen to Studs Terkel radio interviews when he rode the train from Chicago to DC, interviewing Chicagoans about why they were going to the March on Washington. So those Americans felt confident enough to take off the Tuesday, so they focused on the Wednesday, and they would come back on a Thursday, that they had enough confidence in this. And I thought about those Americans last January, which is this is the last time that I will admit that I checked my pay stub, and I was doing that to make sure that my employer had deducted everything I had checked off during the open enrollment period, including for my taxes, including for my health insurance. And that is, by the way, the general advice that is given to salaried employees. Check it beginning of the year, maybe the end of the year, make sure everything's okay. Not for our hourly employers. We want you checking those every 2 weeks, every 4 weeks. Make sure you get paid the hours that you worked. And again, I'm looking at this and I'm thinking about that these deductions are really memorials, not just to the presidents and lawmakers who usually get credit, whether it's Wagner or FDR, but the Americans who had envisioned democracy on the job, as well as those who were denied those workplace rights, that basic Social Security, but kept demanding to be treated as full citizens. They were born long after the American Revolution that we're celebrating right now, but they must be remembered for bringing that ongoing American democratic experiment onto the jobs and onto our pay stubs in the 20th century. Thank you.
I have a question regarding Marietta, Georgia.
Marietta?
The picture you showed had mostly white people in it.
Yes.
and they were off the cotton fields. Does that mean that slavery was still, or the black people were still being in the cotton field and not being considered for jobs that only white people could handle?
So Marietta is a really interesting case because it's a little bit less than 25% of the workforce that will actually be African American. And you're absolutely right to focus on that picture that you were seeing white workers, and also the government photos that we have, they are showing the white women, right? So about 60% of Marietta's workforce is women, and they know that they're going to have to draw on them. But what was really interesting is how energized and excited the Black communities were in the Atlanta area. And so what we do have is, it is true that most of the African Americans working at Marietta, they're going to be janitorial jobs or something like that, but they're still showing up for that. More importantly, they are organizing to protest that one of the things that Atlanta and Marietta had to promise, and also the state of Georgia, they would set up training centers for the work needed to be done in these fields. And you have Black communities organizing to actually make sure that they have the training available. And we do have cases that we know that actually, the person I'm thinking in particular is Ernestine Slade. Her oral history is available through the Kennesaw State Oral History Project about what it took for her to actually get that good paying job. So it is true that majority of the workforce was white for Marietta, but it is not true that that is not because African Americans were not trying and actually having some success. But it's a great story, and that's why I really do love Ernestine Slade's oral history, because she's showing what it took and also how transformative that job was, because she never went back to domestic service. Once she had that skill, once she had that training, she was able then after World War II to go back and get better jobs.
Okay, and then the second picture you showed with Johnson signing, that basically is reinforcing the employment of the black people in this country and bringing that to a head and so forth.
And that's where I think it's very helpful to think about how pivotal that mid-1960s legislation is, because it's saying that you have to guarantee this equal opportunity, the Civil Rights Act, equal opportunity to jobs. And again, the FEPC, although there were attempts to have it at the federal level, and we do have examples at the local and the state, what happens with the EEOC is that it opens up the door to actually start enforcing the law. And I think that that's really pivotal, because you're right, it could have just inscribed that into the law, but it is energy and activism of people of color, of women whose sex is included in the Civil Rights Act, to actually enforce the law that we're still fighting about today, to make sure that there are equal opportunities to it. Although I will say you are right, the challenge of it is, and this is where I'm just starting this book on the paystub, that so much of our basic rights in this country really depend on the job that you have, and that's still today. And so this book is going to end with, the final essay is going to be on the 1099, with none of those deductions, at all, that you yourself have to pay in for what your employer, I'll just say it, should also be contributing. No, but thank you. Those are great questions.
Thank you. What happened that allowed public sector employees to unionize?
Organizing. It comes straight down to that, and it's funny because it depends on which historians you're reading. That they will emphasize that Kennedy does actually an executive order about federal employees, but it really is actually the energy and organizing at the local level to get public sector workers to be recognized. And it's a shame that we never actually had it at the national level. We don't have a Wagner Act for public employees, like at a national level, but we do have individual states. But that is attributed to people continuing to organize and show the value and the importance of the work that they're doing. And that's why we have also, I think, it's not impossible, but it is, private employers these days, for a variety of reasons that I'm happy to go into, have an easier time not bargaining in good faith, delaying recognition of unions, all these things. It's harder to do in the public sector, which is one of the reasons why we have more success in actually public sector organizing that we do. But it is another great example that it doesn't matter. It's not the law that is passed, it's the organizing that becomes before it, and also that people are going to actually enforce the law after, and that's the key. And I think you can really see that in the Massachusetts case, that you get the recognition of municipal employees first before you get to state. Yeah.
You brought up Medicare and Medicaid, and it just made me think about soldiers coming back and being disabled. Did they just retire them and they gave them Social Security, or was Medicaid there because it expanded in the 60s, I believe, to cover more disabled people, not just soldiers?
Yes, and then we'll get in the early 90s with the Americans with Disabilities Act. So the key thing in terms of soldiers is to realize the Veterans Administration part of this, and that you would have exactly for that. Although for me, and this was my previous book, I did a whole book on a history of student loans. Y'all, it doesn't end well for 45 million Americans. There's your spoiler. But part of it is in terms of unpacking what happens with the GI Bill, the famed GI Bill, that there is protections, but one of the unfortunate things that happens with VAs who are disabled is they are actually pushed away from having the opportunity to go to college and universities, especially since many of them we would now recognize today as not being accessible. So we can see exactly that issue in terms of what support you're going to get. But that is actually for the disabled veterans. They're going to have the VA. And the VA, I have to say, I think is really interesting because even though it is technically a national VA, so much depends on what state that you're living in, right? In terms of your access to VA care, where are the centers, all these other kinds of things. Yep.
You mentioned that like we now protest on weekends and they were able to do it on Wednesday. Like, did private employers progressively like chip away at like PTO rights and stuff that doesn't enable employees to do stuff now?
Absolutely. And I think one of the things to think about too is that we have a lot more job insecurity that's happening. And part of that is that one of the reasons we have so few there's many reasons why we have a much smaller percentage of the private sector labor force. But part of that is that if those unions are moving down to the Sun Belt, places like Atlanta and Phoenix that learned how to attract industry during World War II, they're going to do the same damn things. The same things. They're going to pass what are known as right to work laws and make it much more difficult to organize unions in those states. And so if you are moving, in the case of Phoenix, if you're moving your Motorola plant from Chicago to Phoenix, the union isn't coming with you. Right. And so when you are able to close your operations in Chicago, that union doesn't exist anymore. So we can see that chipping away. And all this, there's also phenomenal work done on the chipping away of the law as well, that becomes, even after the passage of the amendments to the Wagner Act, 1947 Taft-Hartley Act, it focuses more on employer free speech, employer rights than employee. It undermines a lot of what the Wagner Act did. And that's just compounded by what states can do because of these right to work laws. The way I think of right to work laws is they're just the canary in the coal mine that will start to undermine workplace rights in other parts of the country once those things are passed.
Given the story of Social Security as it developed, do you think that there is the political will and the societal buy-in to actually keep it in its present form, or at least to deal with the crisis that should develop around 2032?
That's a great question, because the last time we faced that question was in the late 70s and the early 80s, when we did actually have amendments to the Social Security Act to deal with its feasibility in the long term. And I think going back and looking at that, we can see the can being kicked down the road another 50 years is what we're focusing on right now. And I think it's a great question. I think it's a very challenging question because we're in a moment where a lot of Americans are not sure the full extent of what Social Security is. And let's remember that those provisions for single parents have been undermined. They were undermined in the 1990s. And I think the challenge, though, is to think to have the political muscle on the ground to force our elected representatives to do what we want and then to hold them accountable. And we're in a challenging moment to see if that was actually possible. And I think that that's something for us to think about. I wish I could have had an easy answer. Historians will always tell you no one can predict the future. We've seen it before where the American public has been really energized and they have demanded small d democratic action. They have gotten what they've wanted. And I think we're facing a really important challenge today, especially as we look ahead to these midterms that are coming down the pike.
This is a little wonky, but I feel like you're a good person to ask. Do you see any parallels between the New Dealers' intervention in the South, particularly in Georgia, and the Biden administration's intervention during the Bluebird bus factory organizing in Georgia? Because it was...
That's a really interesting question. I will admit, let me be clear with that. When that was happening, I was still in Chicago. So I'm not as versed as I am. There's other things that I'm watching right now that make me feel like echoes of Marietta, or seemingly echoes of Marietta. I think that for me, in terms of thinking about the Biden administration, is Scranton Joe. He is from a union state. He's from Pennsylvania. And I think that that might be a better way of thinking about this effort to actually sort of re-energize organizing. I also think that it's really important that we need to, again, thinking back to that wonderful question about how do we get public employee laws, that one of the things that is helping bring the attention of Democrats back to the labor movement is the energy and organizing of the Starbucks workers, the Hollywood actors and writers, and all these other things who are bringing attention back to these workplace injustices. I think that might be a better way of thinking about it than echo to what was happening in the South. But I might be wrong. It's a great question, though.
Last one.
Maybe it's appropriate to be the last one, being a contrarian.
Okay.
You were describing unions as almost utopian, as a destination to strive to. And I'm wondering if you have any criticism around where unionization actually backfires, produces undemocratic, unfavorable outcomes. And as a second part, maybe I'm happy to offer some thoughts, but I'm more curious to hear yours.
Well, I think and you're right, I did a very small response that one of the things that was important about the FEPC is that workers could bring charges against their unions, and they did. They absolutely did, because there were those undemocratic practices in there. I also think that you're probably thinking about some of the corruption charges that has dogged unions, most famously the Teamsters union, though it certainly isn't in the Teamsters as well. And I think the question there is that the challenge is, because for a lot of the corruption that I wonder if it actually came to mind, is we have this era of insurgent unionism in the 60s and 70s challenging that old labor guard, particularly in the wake of the Civil Rights Act being passed, to make sure that we're having equal opportunities within the union for those kinds of advancement. The other thing that you could be thinking about too is, one of the great ways to convince an employer, Motorola, GE, I can name so many of them, to come on down to the American South and West is the promise that you have a right to work law and that you wouldn't be bothered by unions. And that was actually one of the reasons why also it was, I don't want to say relatively easy, but one of the things that these Southern and Western states were marketing themselves as desirable places to have these wartime factories was that there's not unions here. You don't have to worry about that. We're going to give you a break. And I think it's a very complicated picture in terms of thinking about this. But I take your point, and we can talk about it after, and I also have all sorts of other things that in my head that I thought of with your question. But I do think on the more broad level is that it's right. It has this sort of utopian idea of bringing small d democracy to the shop floor, and it is challenging how it worked out in practice.
Professor Shermer, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for coming out. Have a good night, everybody. Thank you.